Okay, over to you.
Thanks, Joe, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session on what's a very hot and sticky afternoon. I hope you all have some good ventilation where you are. My name's Clare Fussel, and I'm the Diocesan Environmental Advisor for Bristol Diocese, which, for those of you who aren't in the UK, is a diocese of the Church of England in the southwest of the country. And I've been asked to share a little bit about our journey towards becoming, well, I say journey towards becoming, but we were very much at the start of the journey towards becoming a net zero diocese and encouraging our churches and schools to do likewise. So I have a bit of a presentation so you can follow me on the screen. So I'll just open that up for you here. And show. So can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay. Great. So I'm aware that we don't have a huge amount of time, but I just wanted to cover three things really. Firstly, give a bit of a background to making a diocesan commitment to be net zero and declare a climate emergency. Talk a little bit about what we've done so far, particularly around carbon footprinting and deciding priority areas to focus on, and then talk a little bit about some of the challenges we faced and some of the champions and some of the positive things that have come out of it as well. And as Joe says, please do share some comments in the chat. I can't see the questions, but I'm sure once we come out of the slides, we'll be able to see those. So the first image I wanted to show you is this one, which is from November 2019. And this photograph was taken at our diocesan synod when we declared unanimously, voted to declare a climate emergency. And it was then that we committed to be a net zero church by 2030. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got there, because for many, this is the sort of the start of the journey, but actually there was a lot of behind the scenes work taking place to get to this point. And I've just sort of tracked these out here. First of all, it wasn't a sort of top-down thing at all, a little bit like Andy Atkins was talking about earlier. It was very much a grassroots, bottom-up process, and a group of volunteers across the diocese, lay largely, I think there was one clergy person, decided that they wanted to see more action taking place across the churches for environmental protection, and so formed a working group that just met in people's front rooms in 2018, and from that tried to put together climate justice and environment policy, and our sort of diocesan environmental advisor, who was sort of a volunteer post along with lots and lots of other hats that he wore, and sort of guided us in that and helped us to take that to our diocesan synod. And so we then, that environment and climate justice policy laid out 7 areas that were suggested that synod should adopt, everything from encouraging biodiversity to decarbonising to centralising creation care into worship and teaching, and there are other areas as well around investments. So it covered quite a big remit, and that that policy was then agreed by synod, and it was a very good structure on which to build, because we very clearly knew what, as a whole church, we were aiming for. And alongside this policy process, a motion came from one of our parishes in Bristol City, and it was the parish of St Paul's and Cottam, and they passed a motion for their PCC, just their church council, to declare a climate emergency. And then they took that motion to their deanery, which is their regional city grouping of churches, and asked them to do the same, and that was passed within the city. And then that deanery took it to the wider, using the kind of the structure of the Church of England, took it to the diocesan synod, and encouraged all churches then to declare a climate emergency in 2019. So it very much came from one church working up the ladder to the whole of the diocese, and then we became the first in the Church of England to do so. and we were in a position then to be able to push the National Synod, the General Synod, in 2019 to commit to 20 years earlier targets, so to be carbon neutral by 2030, not by 2050, which was what they had previously were aiming for. So yeah, so there you go. That was the sort of the process, really. So that kind of commitment came from behind the scenes work from a group of individuals who were passionate about this and used the sort of the systems of the Church of England to make it more of a priority. And that all happened up till sort of the end of 2019. Then, of course, coronavirus hit and the pandemic. And that was a bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, a lot of the momentum that was built over that time felt like it stalled, because people just had a new crisis to deal with. I mean, the climate crisis was still very much on people's agendas, but they were just, now having to deal with day-to-day working out how to operate in a pandemic. So on one hand, some of the larger decarbonising work had to pause, but on the other hand, people at an individual level in churches and communities found that there was an upswell in interest in this. There were more people spending more time at home in their local environments, appreciating nature, feeling the precariousness, I think, of life and this turmoil that we're going through, and wanting to do something practically. So while at an institutional level it felt paused, we had overnight almost 50 plus churches electing eco-champions, greening their churchyards, switching their energy providers, and taking action in the time when churches were otherwise closed and limited in what they could do. And we, as a diocese, have two real focuses, and they sort of feed into each other. One is to be net zero carbon, and the other is to engage as many churches as possible to really prioritise the environment. And that's a sort of virtuous circle, because the more that churches realise that this is core to their discipleship and core to what we're called to be as Christians in the world today, the more that sort of fuels the cycle of decarbonising. So hopefully they're very much linked. But I wanted to talk a bit more about the net zero piece of work, because one of the other benefits of having a bit more space last year with the pandemic was that we had some time to do some number crunching and to work out a carbon baseline. And we gathered data as best as we could, knowing that it's not going to be full data set for every last church and cathedral and school, but as much information we could based on churches' energy bills and schools' energy certificates and clergy housing energy certificates as well, to work out what the full carbon footprint of the diocese was, and found that was just over 4,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And then we could drill down and say, well, where are the biggest chunks of that carbon footprint coming from? And you can see here quite clearly that the largest chunk of the pie is our schools. We have 72 schools, mostly primaries, and they're open all week long and are very busy used buildings. And so understandably, they have the biggest chunk of that in terms of their heating. And then also, you'll see on the right-hand side of the graph, large churches. 12% of our churches represent, as you can see, about half of all church emissions. That's because we have certain churches, not necessarily large in size, but large in activity, that are often running cafes or preschools or other things that mean that they have a significant chunk of that carbon footprint as well. So knowing that, it made it a lot easier to say, well, rather than focusing on clergy housing or travel or the bishop's office or all these other areas, or the cathedral even, it makes sense to prioritise first focusing on decarbonising schools and large churches. And so based on that, we have a 10-year plan that's split into 2-year increments. And in the first 2 years, 2021 to 23, we're primarily working alongside those 2 categories to try and make as big a saving in carbon as possible. So, and then once we've established ways of working and ways of a sort of a decarbonisation plan with those groups, we can move on to some of the other areas. And so, given some of the number crunching we've done, we hope that this strategy will see us realise 40% reductions overall by targeting those 2 areas by 2025. So that's equivalent to about 1,700 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. As I say, the data isn't foolproof. We don't have as much information as we'd like, but we're adding to that all the time. And the other thing to say is offsetting is something that we've really considered and is a tricky one, because we don't want to be spending money on offsetting when we could be investing that in decarbonising. So we've decided not to do any offsetting at all for any of our carbon emissions until after 2025, so that we have as much chance to invest in bringing down emissions first, and then we'll have an incremental ramp up of the offsetting. So with 25% offsetting in the first couple of years, going up to 100% by 2030. But hopefully by then, the amount that we'll be looking to offset is as minimal as possible. So let's talk a little bit more about our schools and our large emitting churches and our plans with those 2. So the main challenge with both is with the bottom line, money. We've had conversations with all of our large emitting churches now, and all of our schools that are in scope, and the majority of them say we'd love to do all of these things. We'd love to have low carbon heating, we'd love to have LED lighting and solar panels, but we just don't have the money to invest in this. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is doing energy audits in both schools and churches, so that we can see exactly what interventions lead to what emissions reductions, and what the price of those is as well, so that when we can target in each of those organisations the one thing that they can do that will reduce their emissions the most. So, and then we're in a position to support them with funding it, and support both with grants and loans, and also with encouraging and supporting them to access government funding, for instance. So in terms of grants and loans, we've established just now, as in this month, a diocesan grant and loan scheme. We've reappropriated other funds to provide grants of up to £100,000 for our schools, and loans of up to £250,000 to decarbonise. And similarly with our churches, supporting them with fundraising as well, to be able to find money to pardon me, use the low carbon alternative. And one thing I wanted to mention as well, that isn't strictly in our scope actually for reaching net zero, but I think is important nonetheless, is the issue of divestment. And I know that's being touched on as well over this conference. And we, along with another diocese, have pulled out of fossil fuel companies entirely. And we've taken out of fossil fuels and committed to ensuring that remains the case, because that's a big hidden part of our carbon footprint. Pardon me. And as I mentioned at the beginning, church engagement is a big part of this, and alongside some of these sort of more centrally led initiatives to decarbonise, we're also supporting churches to engage with schemes like Eco Church, and we've been so encouraged by how many churches have really embraced that. We've got dozens of awards over the last year, and I think about 40–45% of churches are now working towards an award. And this is a really helpful way to not just think about the boiler and the lighting and the practical things about the building, but responding to the call to care for God's creation. Pardon me, I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm a bit full of sniffles and coughs today, I'm afraid. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the Eco Champion scheme as well, where we now have 50-odd churches who have elected an individual to ensure that the environment is on every PCC agenda. It's communicated regularly with church congregations, so it doesn't become an add-on, it doesn't become something that a small subcommittee deal with and nobody else really knows what's going on. That environmental work is part and parcel of what it is to be church. And that's a fledgling scheme. We just started that in January this year, but already you have seen, particularly at a deanery level, we have 6 out of 7 of our deaneries within the diocese with an Eco Champion as well, it making a real difference. And I love hearing the reports back from what people are doing and how they're sharing across churches and supporting each other. So that's been a really good development as well. And finally, I think another area that has been really helpful in working on this is not trying to do it alone. There are so many other organisations out there who can help you, and in particular trying to find other organisations that are working towards net zero as well, so that you can partner up and share what works, what doesn't work, and even share your sort of policies and documents so you can steal things from each other, because we're all trying to work to the same end goal, so it makes sense to share along the way. And I think that's within my 20 minutes, just about. So sorry, that was a bit of a whiz through, but I'll stop sharing and we can have a chat.
Claire, thank you. Brilliant.
Sorry about the coughing.
No, have some water or something. That's fine, and hope you're feeling better soon. Amazing for you just to do that presentation, having not been well recently. But thank you. A really inspiring story there of diocese coming together to actually act quickly. Not all of us are from dioceses which act so quickly, and that's a really inspiring thing to see how you and other churches are coming together in the deaneries and how you're putting a lot of momentum into this, and I think that's something that we can all be really encouraged by. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to encourage everyone to add any questions on the screen, or as we did just before, maybe a hand up and I can unmute you if you'd like to say a comment or ask Claire a question. There was something from Nicola here. I don't know if you can see the chat, Claire. Just the question, a tricky question. Yeah, a tricky question over fossil fuel divestment or engagement, I guess. Maybe that's a nod to the national church not choosing to divest just yet. And I wonder if you could just comment on that, and maybe a little bit more on the sort of balance between how we decide about offsetting as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. I mean, I think the national church has committed to divesting by 2023. So actually not that long away from any organisation that isn't in line to meet the Paris Agreement. And that's pretty much any fossil fuel company that isn't massively changing its business model to invest in renewables instead of fuels. So I think in reality, within 18 months it will be a moot point for the church anyway, because that divestment commitment will kick in. For us, we felt that actually engagement was it felt like we'd been engaging for a long time, and it felt like it makes more of a statement to divest what we have invested, which was actually very little, in fossil fuels, and be able to make that stand, than it was to use whatever little influence we had as a diocese to engage and trying to change those companies' behaviour, because we felt that actually weighing it up, it makes more sense to divest when that's something that we really don't feel churches should be investing in, and the same as other unethical goods like tobacco or gambling or whatever it might be. And was there a question about offsetting as well?
Yeah, just there was
Offsetting
something in that, just Nicola mentioned offsetting or not of green energy, and the balance there is quite a tricky one. But
yeah,
you've been through that, mentioned a bit.
Yeah, again, I mean, I'm not sure about offsetting of green energy, but so we, as I say, chose to delay offsetting for as much as possible, because there's always an opportunity cost between, are you going to spend your money on offsetting, or are you going to spend your money on decarbonising, and recognising that there will always be a residual amount of carbon left in your supply chains and everything else that you will need to take responsibility for eventually. And so before 2030, we've committed to offsetting for whatever carbon remains, but I think it makes sense to try and put every last penny into reducing emissions first.
Yeah. Natasha has a great question, and something that I know lots of churches seem to fear, just the financial cost and implications of making such a change. And she said that she's interested in how Bristol has repurposed diocesan funds for environmental grants and loans. Was that difficult, and where did that come from?
Yeah, very good question. And I'm hoping this will be a drop in the ocean. There'll be more money in the pipeline. But I think that if we have declared an emergency, we need to resort to it. And you can't sort of declare an emergency and then rearrange the deck chairs. You need to be able to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, to mix my metaphors. And I think so the fund I referred to is specifically for our educational establishments. So it was a foundation that already exists historically to support church schools, and that was to support them on a whole spectrum of different things. And so that has been repurposed to only provide funding for decarbonising. So it's basically taking money away, I suppose, from other things that schools might want to get investment in, and really prioritising on decarbonising. And that was an easy process, in a sense, in that the chair of our Board of Education is on the board of this foundation, and so was able to make that recommendation. And I think that it's difficult when a lot of dioceses are facing deficits and church funds aren't where they should be always. And I think that trying to seek those opportunities, having conversations with your diocese about what funds exist and how they might be reallocated, is a good conversation to have. I think most dioceses should have finance committees and can at least have that conversation.
Yeah. What do you think individual churches could focus on because everyone talks about doing maybe just one step or a quick win to help springboard a congregation on one journey? What do you think is a good first step for churches to do?
And I would say go on the eco church journey, because that's just it covers all bases, really. For those of you who haven't looked at eco church yet, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at their website, because it has lots of information on. But there'll be, sometimes it's quite hard to keep momentum up within a church if there's only a few of you and you're talking about one thing over and over. Whereas eco church allows you to widen that up. It has resources for supporting young people to get involved, and it has resources for sermons and worship, as well as thinking about your buildings and your land. And it also encourages you to work with others and seek out partnerships. So there's always something that you can be doing. And if you kind of hit a bit of a roadblock on one area, you can speed ahead with another. And so it just gives you a whole range of ideas as to how you can engage your church, really. And I know that, having spoken to quite a number of churches who've engaged with Eco Church over the last year or so, while we've had the pandemic, that it's been quite a good other focus, aside from sort of all the worries of trying to do worship on Zoom and everything else. It's something that you can kind of be cracking on with. So it's been quite helpful.
Claire, thank you. Mike, I hope that goes some way to just answering some of your questions about Eco Church, just helping the momentum go. It sounds like now's the time to be putting our efforts into that journey. Really helpful. Everyone, I'm really sorry. Would love to talk more about this and hear more from you, Claire, but we're out of time, sadly. And we've got another workshop just coming up in a few minutes. If you're staying in this room, it will be sustainable and unsustainable seaworthiness. And there are others around as well. But do just take a couple of minutes. But thank you, Claire, for everything you've shared with us today. Really, really inspiring. Thank you, and bless you as you carry on doing great work.
Thank you for having me. It's great to share. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I'll stop recording now and everyone could be free to go.